Welcome to the FIDE World Cup Tromsø 2013 final. The first game, Kramnik had the white pieces against Andreikin, and that is the game I'm going to talk about now. The game started out with d4, e6, c4, knight f6, and here of course white can choose to allow the Nimzo-Indian with knight c3, but Kramnik decided on knight f3, and of course this is a crossroad again if black to choose the Queen's Indian, Bogo Indian, or as he chose in the game, transpose to the Queen's Gambit, declined, d5. Bishop g5, bishop e7, knight c3, h6, all very standard moves, bishop h4, castle, e3, and b6. This is the so-called Tartakover variation, which has been very popular, especially on the highest levels in World Championship matches. White here has many choices. Almost all normal moves have been tried. In this game, Kramnik chose bishop d3, and Andreikin immediately captured on c4, using the momentum that the bishop has just moved, and now the bishop needs to move a second time, and continued with bishop b7, occupying the long diagonal, castle, and knight b to d7. So at this moment, practically both sides are completed development, and we're still, of course, in theory, but each side needs to choose a plan. It's more complex for white than it is for black. Black's plan normally is to try to simplify the position and play c5. And with that exchange of pawns in the center, try to fully equalize. White is trying to prevent that. White played queen e2, and black played a6, preventing ideas of bishop a6 and such. And now came rook fd1, preparing for that very c7, c5 pawn advance. So if black would make that move, the pawn could take, and black would have uncomfortable situation with the pin along the d5. And here black played a simplifying move, trying to trade the dark squared bishops with knight d5. All this has been played before in a game where white now continued with knight takes knight on d5, followed by trading bishops on e7, and then retreating the bishop to d3. That's of course a whole other road compared to Kramnik's choice. Kramnik rather kept the dark squared bishops on the board by retreating it to g3, keeping more pieces on the board. And here it's an interesting situation. Black chose to try to again simplify by trading first knights on c3. However, with that strengthening white's center after pawn takes back, and now he played bishop to d6. Another alternative here for black was to play knight f6 to prevent white's advancement in the center with e3, e4. After bishop d6, it's another critical moment for white, what to do. Of course, trading bishops on d6 and opening the c file would favor black, so therefore that's not something to seriously consider for white. On the other hand, a move like knight e5 certainly would come to mind as well. But Kramnik played e4, focusing on occupying and advancing in the center. Game continued with bishop trade on g3. Now white has double pawns on the g file. And black played b5, a very interesting plan to, after bishop d3, play knight b6 and have some control there on the c4 square perhaps, or as we'll see, with some knight a4 ideas. And this is another interesting moment where Kramnik found an interesting idea. I think there may be other ideas for white as well, but he played queen e3. The first idea that comes to mind here that white may want to play g3, g4, g5 and get rid of the doubled pawns on the g file and perhaps open up the h file and develop an attack there quickly, especially given that all the black pieces are on the other side of the board. But black didn't give time for any of that. Black created some counterplay on the queen side. Let's see how that developed. knight h4, immediately targeting white's pawn on c3. And here the plan was bishop c2. Now this bishop c2 move, of course, kind of threatens to capture on a4, ruining black's pawn structure there. And let's say if black would retreat with the knight, then there could be ideas of white playing queen d3, followed by e5, and creating some mating threats on h7 and forcing further weakening on the king side for black. Black instead played knight b2, of course, that's the logical thing to do. And I think here Kramnik did something rather surprising, perhaps something really good, but at least during the game I wasn't so convinced. It certainly worked for him, though, as the final outcome justified him. He played rook d to b1, attacking the rook, knight c4, and now queen c1. A very unusual formation of the white two rooks and queen all on the first rank on the queen side. But of course it's a temporary thing, and white has something specific in mind, as we'll see already in the very next move. Black finally got to play c5, which is the typical liberating move in such situations. And this is a temporary pawn sacrifice. Of course, if white would capture the pawn, black would win it back real quick by attacking it with the rook or the queen immediately. And here comes the key move. White plays a4, immediately targeting black's pawn on b5. There is a pin, of course, at the moment, therefore black cannot capture on a4. Black needs to either defend the pawn or come up with a counterattack. If black would now protect the pawn with the bishop, with bishop to c6, I think white would play bishop d3. The game continued with pawn captures on d4, and of course the pawn captures back on d4. And now black could protect the pawn with the queen d7, for example, but he chose to play rook to c8, a tricky move in the sense that if now white captures on b5, which he did, and after pawn captures back, rook tries to capture and win a pawn, then black immediately would play knight d6, creating a fork, a double attack on white's rook on b5 and the pawn on e4, and that would be excellent for black. And naturally, Kramnik didn't fall for this simple trap, but moved the queen out of that potential pin on the c file by playing queen e1. And now, of course, the pawn is hanging on b5, so black must protect it, which he did, played bishop c6. Another way was to play queen d7, also reasonable looking. White continued with rook b4. At this point, I think white has a very comfortable position because the b5 pawn will be a target of an attack, and on top of it, white can try to prepare an advancement of the d pawn, creating a passed pawn there, which we'll see in the next few moves. And while black doesn't really have that much of counterplay. Andreikin played rook a8, offering the exchange of rooks, and Kramnik rejected that by moving the rook to d1, getting ready for that pawn advancement with d5. Black played rook a3, and now came the very exciting part of the game. d5 anyway. Takes, takes, and now the pawn cannot be taken without loss of material after rook takes b5. And what to do now for black? If the bishop retreats to d7, then white created a passed pawn on the d file and would continue with queen e4 immediately, provoking a weakness on the king's side in front of black's king. But Andreikin's plan was to play now rook e8, hoping that the queen would go to f1, and that would be a very awkward passive position for the queen. And this is what I think Andreikin has underestimated. The beautiful queen sacrifice that at first doesn't seem to be all that strong. But as we found out during the game, it actually is a lot more dangerous for black than it first seems. So Kramnik played d takes c6, capturing the bishop, but giving up the queen. Rook takes queen with a check, so obviously white cannot take the black queen, but must recapture. Recaptured with the knight. Very important to keep the momentum. So now the black queen is under attack. Queen c7, and rook takes b5. So what we see right now is that white gave up the queen for a rook, a bishop, and a pawn. So by pure numeric values, that's pretty much an even trade. However, because white maintains that very strong pawn on c6, it is only black who needs to worry about losing the game. Fortunately for white, the c6 pawn right now is taboo because of the back rank checkmate immediately with rook b8. Black played therefore g6, making sure that no longer are any worries there about the back rank. Of course, it's important also to note that Andreikin was pretty short on time already at this point. And came rook c5, not only protecting the pawn on c6, putting the rook behind the pawn where rooks typically belong, but at the same time also attacking the black knight on c4. And here the knight went to e5, trying to perhaps go after that pawn on c6 and think of ideas of counterattacking with knight g4. Maybe knight d6 was a little bit better defense, preventing the white bishop from coming to e4 so easily as it did in the game. Came knight e5, and now immediately bishop e4, protecting that pawn, which is of course the key piece in the position now for white to win. Black played knight to g4, perhaps thinking or hoping for some ideas of knight takes f2 at some point, but those are only, of course, dreams from black's perspective here. Knight d3, king g7, bishop f3, and knight f6. So now the knight on f6 well protects against potential rook d7 moves to chase the queen away, but white has a simple plan to win this game. And the first step in that direction is to trade the knights. So white will have more accessible squares like d7 or b7 to chase the queen away. And that's what we'll see the next few moves. Knight b4, h5, rook dc1 first, making sure that after the knight trade the white rook can capture back on d5 from c5. Came rook a7, and here we go, knight d5. Black has no choice but to trade, bishop trade, and this is move 40, so white already reached the time control here, while black had to make one more move to reach the 40th move. If black would kind of do some waiting move, like say king f8, white would double up the rooks on the b file in probably either order, rook b5 and then rook c b1, followed by rook b7, and I think white would probably be winning in any case. Black instead played queen d8, which is a provocative move. Of course, the idea being that black would like to sit perhaps the rook on c7 and free up the queen, but it allows white to advance the pawn forward to c7. And black sacrificed the rook in order to get to this endgame of two rooks versus a queen with equal pawns on the king's side, 3 for each color. Now, it's very interesting because some years back in the World Championship final between Kramnik and Peter Leko, they reached a very similar type of position. However, white, or the side with the two rooks rather, didn't have the double pawns on the g file. It was straight f, g, h pawns. And the side with the two rooks won there as well, although it was believed that perhaps black could have held the game with perfect defense. Interestingly, in such situation, it's an exception, I guess, from the standard rules. The fact that white has the doubled pawns helps white because there will be situations where it will help the white king to escape from the perpetual checks. White's plan here is very simple. It's simply to double up against the f7 pawn and try to capture it. And then the resulting pawn endgame, if the queen would capture the rook and then give up itself for the two rooks, the 3 pawns against the 2 would be a theoretical win for white. And that is what we'll be seeing here now. Rook e1, the rook aims to go to e7, king h6, and here we are, doubled rooks on the 7th rank, threatening the pawn on f7. And as I mentioned, if king now, let's say, returns to g7, then rook simply takes the pawn, and queen takes rook, rook takes queen, king takes rook, king h2, and white wins quite simply. Therefore, black played rather f6, trying to maintain the queen on the board. Came rook e to d7, attacking the queen. Now, if the queen moves away from the 5th rank, for example, to a2, white's idea would be to check, rook h7, king g5, rook c5 check, f5, and then go after the g6 pawn. It's important to remember that generally you want to go after the pawn which is the base of a pawn chain. In other words, a pawn that no other pawn can protect. That's the weakest link in a pawn chain. So after white played rook e to d7, attacking the queen, black continued with queen a5, and now came f4, threatening immediately checkmate with rook h7, because now the pawn took away the king's escape square on g5. Black has not much of a choice but to play g5 to open a little bit of air for the king on g6. And now white perhaps can win other ways as well, but Kramnik played very precisely, playing king h2, avoiding any checks that would come. Now black cannot trade pawns on f4 because white would win the queen immediately after 2 checks, rook h7, king g6, rook c to g7, king f5, and then rook takes h5, skewer, winning the queen. Therefore, now black had to play king g6, and f took on g5. And here black played king takes g5. I think pawn takes would be a little bit better move here, making white's life slightly harder, although I don't think it would change the outcome of the game. King g5, rook h7, again white renews that same threat of next playing rook c to g7, king f5, and then rook takes pawn, winning the queen. So black has to do something about it. Played f5, rook g7 came anyway, king f6. For a moment white cannot take that pawn on h5 because the rook on g7 would be hanging. Therefore rook a7 first, attacking the queen. Queen b4, rook a6 check, king g5 would be suicidal, checkmate immediately with rook g7, king e5, and rook takes h5. So now white made tremendous progress, won a pawn, and the only thing white needs to do next is win that last pawn, the f5 pawn, by attacking it a second time with the other rook as well. Came queen b1. If instead black tries to avoid the rook a5 check, for example with queen b5, white would simply maneuver the rook to a3 and then over to f3, and black couldn't hold on to the pawn in any case. Check, king f6, and rook f5. Again, if black would try to give up the queen for the 2 rooks, it would be an easily won pawn endgame for white. Came king g6, rook fg5, and now from here, as they say, it's only a matter of technique. And Kramnik certainly shows that he knows how to win it. King f6, rook b5, queen c2, check, king g7, rook b6. White is methodically forcing the king further down, and of course, as we know, when the king gets all the way to the back rank, there will be some checkmate threats or skewer tricks coming up. Queen c5, check, king f8. If the king tries to remain on the 7th rank with king f7, white would play rook to c6, and then after queen e5, a cute skewer trick, rook c7 check, and the queen cannot take the rook because of rook h7. After king f8, rook h7, queen f5, rook gg7, queen e6, rook e7, and black resigned. If black would now play on a few more moves, queen d6, the next move would be rook d7, queen f6, trying to hang on to both dark squares d8 and h8, avoiding checkmate, and then white would just play rook d8 check, queen takes, rook h8, and then grabbing the queen and winning. What a wonderful masterpiece by Kramnik. Thank you for watching.